world is really radically changing, and there's a history here, though, that's really interesting that I'm going to try to fly through a bunch of slides and show the relevance of purchase power agreements and what actually happened and how we got to where we are today. And this part of what's happening today, and certainly this historic, and it really is historic jump forward that with Obama putting out his executive order in March in terms of trying to move the sustainability issue and move sustainability across the country. All right, so I was here in the 1970s, and we had this thing called the oil crisis. In 1976, the oil embargoes, and there were skyrocketing oil prices, gas lines, capacity shortages, and people had this thing about maybe we need to look for alternative energy and preservation of non-renewable resources. And there was the issue of the contribution to environmental, though that certainly wasn't the driver. So the federal government promoted or passed this law called PPA. And under PPA, which was really monumental, and this was out in the Carter administration, the goal was to promote independence and preservation of natural resources by eliminating regulatory and economic obstacles to alternative energy development. And interestingly, the Fuel Use Act in 1978 passed at the same time, forbid the use of, limits natural gas, not forbid it, but gas for power generation, but it exempted this class of generators called cogenerators, which were part of PURPA. The Public Utility Policy Act established two types of qualifying facilities, and if you qualified for the program, either you were a cogenerator doing thermal and electric or small power producers, which is where the renewables fell. It created, and this was the key, it created a utility obligation to purchase whatever energy capacity. We had vertically integrated monopolies throughout the country, and the utilities basically said, okay, that's fine, generate to your heart's content, but we're not buying this stuff, and why would we? We're controlling the systems, and this was really contentious when PURPA was passed. And I'm watching my friend from Duke here, so I have to be really careful to say good things about the utilities here. But this was really contentious that they were going to have a law that required the utilities to buy the independent power and to let them into the grid and into the system. And we're going to get to the relevance of that in terms of what the federal government's about to do or is doing. The QS were permitted to make wholesale power, and they were exempted from being utilities. The power purchase agreements themselves, so we had these monopsony buyers. We had monopsonies, we had multiple sellers selling to a buyer, and they were the primary off-takers of these contracts, and these were the investor-owned utilities. Some states also allowed what we call retail access or retail sale. You could sell on-site if you were generating power from one of these qualifying facilities. And in California, for example, which is now where I lived in New York at the time, California added you could sell to two contiguous neighbors, but it was not a retail sale, and this is really significant. The whole power market and the power purchase agreements were wholesale power agreements, not what we're talking about a lot today, which is really a retail or a distribution type of sale that goes on, a distribution type of agreement. And of course, as I said earlier, we had the must-take obligation, which was really important in terms of making this thing move forward. But this was really contentious, not only how you get to the terms and conditions of the power agreement, but even most importantly, the prices. And the prices led to what we call the avoided cost debates. The pricing under the PPA were at the utilities avoided cost to make the ratepayer indifferent. The qualifying facility under these purchase power agreements was paid the same thing the utility would have spent to produce or procure the power from one of its traditional resources. And that was, again, very key in terms of the pricing. The battles, though, over what that cost really was and what the incremental or avoided cost was were huge, and lots of my career was spent, certainly in the 80s, going across the country and in proceedings before public service commissions or utility commissions deciding what that pricing would be. The benefits from alternative energy, and again, this is so key because it's identical almost to 35 years later. We needed independence from foreign imports. The qualifying facilities, contrary to what a lot of the arguments made on the other side of the aisle, where they enhanced system reliability, reduced the need for reserve margins and transmission capacity, and these new facilities were deploying best available control technology, which enhanced the efficiency and distributed generation, where you had lots of generation ending up in load centers and load pockets, particularly on the industrial sides through cogen. Purple was a huge success, and of course I'm looking at people on this side of the pole, but completely biased here, but Purple was an enormous success. And the reason that it was so successful that we, and this is key again in pricing, which will come out to be brought down, I'll bring down a little bit to the issue today, we were paid the utilities avoided costs. Well, the utilities, with all due respect, get to rate base whatever they spend and whatever their costs are. So not surprising when an independent power developer gets paid a price, but it's not based upon what his costs are, it's how cheaply or how efficiently he can produce the power. There was a really nice gap there, and it created a tremendous market, and we had overcapacity. We had too much coming online. The success of that, and the lesson that it taught the federal government and then the state governments, is that we didn't have to get paid the utilities avoided costs. We could make the independent power producers compete among themselves. And we moved from a utility avoided cost regimes to what I'll call to a competitive bid, an RFO or an RFP. And that'll be something similar that we can look at in terms of the federal government of how you go out to procure. It's no longer relevant, the relevance here in terms of pricing today is that it's what the independent power producer, the solar, the renewable, the wind producer can provide you in terms of your cost for electricity. What's not relevant or what you're competing against is your otherwise applicable retail, and many times in the military and other things they have special rates, but you have an otherwise applicable retail rate, and the independent power producer, the renewable producer, is competing against or has to look at, and someone already said to me this morning, well, we're trying to do this, but the ceiling is their current rates, what they're paying. You have to save them money if they're really going to get permission. So there's a huge financial driver here. The game changer here, and this is, for years, what I did was run around the country and produce and guilt a lot of regulators and legislators to have RPS, say this is a great thing. We, in particularly, given what happened subsequently right now, we're the biggest gas producer in the world, though. Don't totally fall into those logic. If you know, Russia's at, I think, 37.7, and we're at 37.9% of the gas. So we are the biggest, with all these ads that the natural gas industry is running. But we became, right now, in terms of being flushed with oil and gas and shale and the fracking and things. So preservation, energy independence and preservation of non-renewable resources is kind of off the table in terms of the rationale. The game changer, the silver bullet that came along, was climate change and the buy-in. But with that came the politics. And this is, again, really important in terms of where we're going, because the Obama and the executive order steps away from the gridlock as to, and I don't want to be too political here, but which side of the aisle on, but there's, climate change isn't real and there's really nothing we can do about it anyway, versus people who are moving ahead. And the key here is not only is the federal government now under this executive order moving ahead, but this is absolutely key, but this also sets up the framework for the purchase power agreements you're going to be looking at. It's the private sector that's the driver right now. Because Washington is paralyzed, you're not going to get through legislation with the coal and the gas lobby and the oil lobby and all of the stuff that's going on in Washington. But what's happening outside of Washington is major corporations across the country, across the world, are saying, we believe in sustainability, we have goals similar to what Obama's done in the executive order, and we need access to a renewable energy product in a way that we can meet our sustainability goals. And frankly, in many of these cases, they don't care what happens in Washington. They don't care about what the local utilities are saying or doing, and the ones that are out front, which we're going to get to, are on the program. Duke is one of them that has a tremendous, wonderful program in terms of the buy-in to the importance of this in terms of the introduction of renewable energy into the grid. But this is coming from not the top, not a bunch of, I'd like to say now, instead of a bunch of Jerry Blooms guilting a bunch of legislators and commissioners into having RPS standards across the country, the people at the table now are Microsoft and Google and Apple and Yahoo and IKEA, and all these people are in this situation where they are saying we want access to the renewable energy product, and we're going to get that access which we're going to cover today through the purchase power agreements as one of the main vehicles. But this is a tremendous paradigm shift where it's a bottom up, it's a consumer, and now the federal government on top of it who wants to be a lead, which is so important and dramatic in terms of saying there's a reason why we're going to go after them, we're going to do these things. And the impatience, if you will, in the private sector and now in the public sector to say, debate will be what it will be. We don't have to win that debate. We're going to start contracting. We're going to start going after renewable energy. We need this to meet our goals. Please help us figure out what those tools are. And one of those tools are certainly the purchase power agreements. And so the public and the private sector seek alternatives. There's a whole bunch of reasons, but price, price, price. Even with the military and even with government buildings, you got to be competitive in terms of your pricing. That's just absolutely important. The other thing is reliability and stability. This is a key factor again that's coming into this because, and this is dramatic. On the governmental side, one of the things that's been introduced is national security. People are concerned about what happens if, in fact, say you have a military base and there's some type of terrorist or other problem where the systems go down. How do we be responsive? So the idea of bringing distributed generation, the idea of bringing renewable energy, the idea that facility could function independent of the power grid is becoming a key factor and a key driver in terms of national security. That is, again, that's a new addition that was not in the dialogue for the last 35 years that I've been doing this. And then the third thing, of course, is the sustainability product. People have had set goals, what Obama said. But there's this interrelationship. I was at a great meeting in Washington last fall, OPEC plus 40, and it was Henry Kissinger, who was kind of old and all over the place a little bit, but Madeleine Albright and Leon Panetta and Schlesinger, and people from the military. And to listen to the military talk about the importance of all the alternatives, including renewable energy, in terms of how we maintain energy independence, not because we have to stop importing oil, but renewable energy is a way to have an issue of national and international security and U.S. dominance. It's, again, a tremendous game changer in terms of what we do. And all this is happening outside of context of whether we could get the Republicans and Democrats in Congress to agree on a green standard, a green plan, or whatever it might be. The public and private sectors and active market participants. Public and private sectors are taking greater control of their energy future. This, again, is key. We're not dependent upon the systems. We're going to figure out what type of access we can have to what type of products that are going to help us meet our sustainability goals. They are owners and off-takers of renewable electrons, the private sector, and this is absolutely key to the next point. The reason this is happening, and again, this is in context, so there's lots of nuancing here, so don't jump all over, but the reason the Googles and the Apples and the Yahoos in the federal government is going directly to the renewable is that they're not getting the product in most places around the country directly from the utilities. And it's not the utilities' fault in terms of the product, the resource mix, what they have, but they need to figure out, and so in many of these cases, the Duke again being a great example, they have, which we'll talk about the deal, and they're doing some of these direct deals with and figuring out how to take this specific product and this specific facility. But that's a different structure than saying the utility is just going to offer this green product, or more important, beyond the electron, what happens to the renewable energy credits or the green attributes, which is a part of who owns that and who gets credit for it and how that gets used, is a key issue in terms of the power purchase agreements. The various deal structures bring value to green. If you're selling the green to the investor-owned utility who then retires the RECs, there's no value in the market. There's no value that's really for the green. What the electric companies want is stable, cheap electrons. Green and sustainability and climate change reduction is a whole different era, and that's what we're trying to capture through the purchase power agreement and these things. Access to renewable products. We're going to go through a bunch of this today, but there are people who are going to do the renewables on site, they can either own the facility or a third party can own it. On your site is a structure we do all the times in terms of power agreements. You could have it off-site. The facility, we'll talk a lot about that in terms of the facility could be elsewhere, and you can just have ownership or the right to the electrons and the green attributes. Customers have rights to renewable energy products. In some cases, they're actually using the electricity. In other cases, they're just putting it into the market and hedging. And that's another way that people have gotten credit for the renewables, but also hedged and used it. So not all the electrons are used to actually power the buildings where these contracts are set up. In many cases, they're used as hedges in the market, and they're sold, the power is sold into the market. The agreements vary. Their products. Some people want just the energy, some people want the energy and the green attributes. Again, I already covered hedges. The quantity, some people will take all of the stuff from a particular generation facility, all of the products, as we call them. The terms are 5 years, 10 years, 20 years. We'll get into the nuancing of how long you have to actually contract for them. And obviously one of the issues with the government and contracting. The prices are all over. They're fixed, they're escalating. The project costs are different, so as I said earlier, you may be looking at multiple possible suppliers of that commodity and what they're going to be competing and answering an RFO or an RFP, a request for proposals. The availability of the ITC, PTC impacts and whether they're going to get extended or not. And I was here in Washington last week, I'm here this week, I get very differing opinions. Will the production tax credit and the investment tax credits get extended? What does that have to do in terms of what's that impact on the price on the purchase power agreements? And maintenance metering liabilities. And one of the key issues is what happens to that facility at the end of the term. This is another key issue in terms of the power purchase agreement. Who has ownership? Who has the rights to it? Can someone come in and take it at the end of it? I said earlier that the private sector direct access, this is tremendous. Look, this is just a very small short list of the many companies, but you can see this is the driver, and then on top of it, we now have the public-private partnerships is one possible, where you would partner with these independent power producers and so forth in order to do a PPA and to provide it. Government buildings with aggressive, the Obama executive order. I already covered the military bases, national security. The federal government has 650,000 vehicles, and they spent $445 billion purchasing power. This is a tremendous opportunity, and it's a tremendous challenge, but a tremendous opportunity for all of us in terms of how we go forward.